Check that you have all of your patterns. Front, front facing, back, collar, sleeve, skirt, sew up the darts on the front panels. Sew up the darts on the back panels. Sew both back panels together along the center back with a 1 cm seam allowance. Center back, side seam. Mark out the pleat notches on the skirt panel. Match up both pleat notches and pin them together. Push the pleat towards the side seams and pin down to secure. Repeat for the other pleat. With both pleats secure, baste along the top with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Repeat for the other skirt panels. Sew one pair of skirt panels along the center with a 1 cm seam allowance. This is the back skirt. Sew the back and back skirt together at the waist with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the front with the remaining skirt panels together at the waist with a 1 cm seam allowance. On the front panel, mark out the zip notches. Sew the zipper starting from the notch with a 1 cm seam allowance. At the bottom of the zip, finish up the rest of the seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the front and back panels together at the shoulder and side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. At the skirt hem, fold up by 1.5 cm and iron well. Then top stitch 1 cm from the folded edge. On the sleeve panel, mark out the notches. Then sew gathering stitches along the sleeve crown in between the notches. Fold the sleeve into half and sew along the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the sleeve to the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance, focusing most of the gathers close to the shoulder seam. Fold up the sleeve hem by 3 centimeters and iron well. Then top stitch 2 centimeters from the folded edge. Repeat for the other side. Fold the collar into half and sew along the short edges with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Snip into the seam allowances to reduce the bulk. Turn it inside out. And iron well. Mark out the notches on the collar panel. On the front, mark out the notches. Align up the notches along the neckline and the collar and pin down to secure. Starting from the collar, the shoulder, shoulder, and then the collar again. On the facing panel, mark out the notches. Match up all the notches on the facing and the front panel. Open up the zip so that both edges of fabric align up. Add a pin at the zip notch. Collar, and shoulder. Repeat on the other side. Sew the facing to the neckline, starting or stopping exactly at the shoulder notch. Make sure to push out the fabric at the zip. You'll be sewing on the outside of the zip with a 0.8 cm seam allowance. Grab a pair of scissors and snip exactly at the shoulder notch through all the layers of fabric, stopping right in front of the stitch. Push all the seam allowances towards the facing and iron well. Then understitch on the facing panel, making sure to catch onto the seam allowances below. At the back neck, sew the two bottom layers together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Pushing away the top layer of the collar, sew from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. Snip into the seam allowances to reduce the tension. Push up all the seam allowances and iron well. For the remaining collar panel, fold it in, making sure to cover the stitches below. And iron well. Then on the right side, sew in the ditch from shoulder to shoulder. From the outside, it will look invisible. And on the inside, you would have sewn onto the collar fabric below. And there you have it. Your dress is completed.